Finally, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you Jamie O'Toole. Jamie flew in from New Mexico last night and has been flying in Arizona, and so we're like super excited to have her here. Jamie, as you probably have maybe seen from the bios, is with the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. And she is really kind of the director of data-driven education. And so we are super excited to have Jamie O'Toole here with us to share some thoughts. And please give her a Nebraska welcome.
All right, so I'm not from Digital Promise. I work for the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. I've been there about 8 years now, and I've had the opportunity to work in the trenches alongside districts and alongside state education agencies with the goal of trying to enable teachers, educators in the classroom, in schools across the country, with access to information that can help them provide high-quality instruction to every student in their classroom. And the mission of the foundation is to improve outcomes for students living in poverty. And so Digital Promise is one of the organizations that we work with, and I played that video because I thought it tightly encapsulated the topic that I'm here to talk to you about today, which is data interoperability. Now, I know this is super enviable to be getting the opportunity to stand up in front of you and talk about a really exciting topic like data interoperability after lunch. So try to contain your enthusiasm, and I will try to be as entertaining as possible on this topic. But the reason that I think Dean asked me to talk about this, and the reason I'm here today, is in all of the work that we've tried to do in terms of bringing teachers access to the right information at the right time, in the right format, this is a barrier. And it's a barrier that we have to work together as a sector to solve, and so I'm here to recruit all of you today and empower you to try to start taking steps within your organization to address challenges related to interoperability. So don't let your data hold you back. Let it propel you forward. And maybe I'll figure out how to use the clicker. Technology, not my strong suit, clearly. Neither is the format of the slide. Okay, what is data interoperability? So the idea of data interoperability, and I think we've got a ratio problem going on here with the slide format, but bear with me. The video mentioned it, seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between systems. There's a lot tied up in here, and what I want to be clear about is like the foundation is never in a position of advocating free flow of data without structure and limitations that are appropriate for privacy and security around those. And that's why I think data interoperability is really important. It's the notion that data shows up where you need it to show up, when you need it to show up, without having to manually intervene, and that you can monitor and control who has access to the data, for what purposes they have access to the data, and you can appropriately protect it as it travels from point A to point B, right? So that's the idea of data interoperability. And as a consumer, we take data interoperability in our lives completely for granted. So I want to see a show of hands who owned a cell phone in the late 90s or early 2000s. Okay, have you had the unfortunate experience of dropping the cell phone in the toilet, spilling your coffee on it, accidentally running it over with your car, whatever makes it meet that unfortunate demise? Everyone's had that experience? So if you owned a cell phone then, when you went to get your new cell phone, you invested a day of time and energy in re-entering your contacts into your cell phone, right? It was terrible. People were texting you, you didn't know who they were. Actually, you didn't do so much texting then. That wasn't really what the phone did. But from a consumer standpoint, this was a huge pain point, right? And so data standards solve this problem. It allows you to move your contacts across platforms. You can transfer from AT&T to Verizon. You can move it across devices. You can use the same centralized set of contacts to make phone calls, to send emails, to do LinkedIn, find Facebook friends, right? Like, that was a real-world data interoperability problem that got solved because it was a huge pain point for consumers. And so these things exist in the real world. I'm having some serious slide difficulties. But the idea of the solution here is really the idea of data standards, right? We have to create a set of policies, a set of definitions that define both what data is, what are individual data elements, what are the definitions of those, how are they transported, what's the common file formats we're going to use, what's the exchange protocol. Those are the keys to getting data to move freely between systems where you want it to go. And so this is not uncommon in other sectors. Other sectors have addressed these problems. It's things that you probably see in your day-to-day life that appear rather seamless. So in the healthcare space, right, when you show up at a doctor's office, they have no problem figuring out how to bill your insurance and getting your bill paid for, rest assured. But data standards work behind the scenes in this, right? Like data about your health, about what happens at the doctor's office is highly private and highly secure. This isn't something that you want posted on a wall in the doctor's office, right? Or like sent via email in an unsecure file. You want that to happen in a protected way. And we have laws like HIPAA that require that, right? So the laws around the use and the transportation or movement of this health data spurred the need for standards. And that's what you get with HL7. It's a standard that defines how healthcare data can move around, with ICD-10, which defines the codes. Like you go to the doctor's office, you get a flu shot, it's got a common code, you know? So the insurance companies all know what that is, what they're gonna reimburse you for. Similarly, in the banking sector, we take for granted that we can move money between financial institutions, that we can pay out money to vendors, and that all just happens behind the scenes, right? Thankfully, our economy would probably be in shambles if not. But that is a problem that was solved by standards. So, you know, when banking was much more local, it wasn't as much of a problem. As the economy globalized, banks became in this challenging position of having to interact much more frequently with other banks. And so they band together and defined a standard messaging format that enables all of these cross-financial institution transactions to happen, and enough of them signed on and agreed to do it that it by default became a standard way of doing business, right? And so I highlight these because these are problems that can be solved. But if I asked you, what does interoperability look like in K-12 today, I'm not sure we've solved this problem. And so I'd like you for just a moment to suspend disbelief, is that what we say? Like imagine what's possible. What is possible? The reason that the foundation invests around the topic of data interoperability is because we believe solving this problem unlocks innovation that can help students, right? That can help improve student outcomes, that can make teachers' lives easier. And so if you think about a world where data moves across the ecosystem of applications that sit within the walls of your organization, okay, some of them sit virtually in the cloud, but you know, the theoretical walls of your organization, we can do a lot of amazing things, right? We can start to bring together data from multiple different assessment platforms. We can tie that to competencies and learning standards. We can get a quick view of what students know and what they don't know. We can bring that together with social emotional learning data and learning styles data to really get a better picture of how students learn, what are the challenges they face, what motivates them, right? We can all of a sudden pair up outcomes data with data around what are students doing in online learning applications that have high levels of usage. What's working, what's not working when it comes to helping students improve their outcomes, right? We can all of a sudden start to make that data more accessible and more visible to parents and teachers who have to support these students to achieve all that they can in the classroom. And so that's why we invest there, right? That's kind of the vision. And so, like, where do we stand versus that vision today? How many people think we have totally conquered this problem? No? Okay. Just checking. If you were convinced, I'd stop talking now and we could all move on to the next session. Okay, so a couple of these things probably look familiar to you. This is what I would call the practical state of data interoperability in K-12 today. And there are exceptions to this, don't get me wrong. There are places where we've made tremendous progress. But as a general rule, if you were to look at the server room of a district, there's a lot of point-to-point data integration happening in proprietary ways, custom ETL, scheduled SFTP transfers, emailing spreadsheets. If you were to look in a classroom or maybe at a data coach in a school, there's a lot of custom-created spreadsheets. They get emailed back and forth. And my favorite, which I actually think has some practical purpose, but is also like a data privacy nightmare when you think about putting on Post-it notes how kids did on a test. Lord knows I hope one of those Post-it notes doesn't fall off and get put in the wrong group. It'd be a terrible intervention day for some student, right? Like this is what it looks like in practical terms. And so like this to me says we're doing a disservice to students if this is the state that we leave the sector in as we move forward, particularly as the rest of the technology advances around us, right? So what's the problem with these solutions? I mean, some of them are super obvious, right? There are issues of time, there are issues of cost, there are issues of risk when this is what we rely upon as data interoperability solutions. So we have people more focused on moving data and finding data than we have them focused on using data to improve outcomes for kids. We are spending money paying for proprietary solutions to move data around, paying for the team of people that support these things behind the scenes to keep the data moving around. And frankly, like, we are increasing the risk that this data gets inappropriately accessed by people who shouldn't have access to it, and that we compromise students' rights to privacy of their data. Okay, so at some point, I'll give you guys access to the slides that don't have all these weird formatting problems. I'm not sure what happened when we transferred it from my laptop to the USB cable, but nonetheless, I know what they say. That's the beauty of it, and then I can make it up if I forget anyhow. So we see these problems play out every day in the classroom, right? And we see these problems play out every day from the technology team. And so if this sounds anything like your organization, you may be in a world where you could use improvement around your data interoperability practices, right? If your teachers are downloading loads of education technology applications from the internet, they are manually keying in roster information, they put grade and assessment data in the LMS and in the gradebook and in their big giant spreadsheet they created, they're going to multiple places when they say, hey, I'm really trying to understand if my kids know how to add fractions with common denominators. And they say, well, to do that, I got to go look at the gradebook to see how they did on this assignment. I have to go look in this assessment tool to see how they did on this quiz. I have to go back and look at data from the summative assessment, and I've now gone back to 3 different places, right? And then my favorite is when they create these awesome ways to get kids to be the data inputters. So, you know, it's like, hey, we're going to give student agency. Kids, fill out this spreadsheet with all of your information and email it to me, and then I can compile it, right? So these are all probably signs of like data interoperability is not working seamlessly, if that's what you're seeing from the classroom perspective. And then if you flip that over and say, well, what does this problem look like from the technology side? I mean, it looks like I've hired people to write ETL to move data around between all of the tools. You know, I've scheduled the SFTPs to move around CSV files. I have chronically broken ETL because the vendor changed their underlying source system, and I'm now going back to try to troubleshoot that. It looks like massive data quality and data validation problems. I go to, you know, produce report cards, and I find out, oops, I might have half of the grades missing somewhere. These things happen in real life, totally traumatic. And it looks like the team on the technology side spending a lot of time pulling custom reports for everyone in the district because these custom reports require querying all kinds of different data sources where this siloed data lives, right? And so does that resonate with anyone? Is anyone experiencing this challenge? None, you all have it solved, totally. It's been, I hear you. So this problem can be pretty large, pretty overwhelming. Like, I wouldn't walk off from this conversation today and say, hey, you should expect to make drastic change in this problem and totally resolve all of this in the next 12 months, right? Data interoperability is hard because getting systems to communicate is both a technical challenge, but it's a people and a change management challenge. And so part of what we think about when we work with organizations who are tackling these problems is how do you lay the right pieces, the right foundation to start the work to create an interoperable system of data within your district or within your school. And so The first part of this is really about establishing data governance. Data governance is both an organization structure within your district, but also a process or a set of processes that really define what is data in your district, what are common definitions and common metrics for the data that's used in your district, right? That puts in place the policies around which source systems are most appropriate to utilize or draw which types of data from, right? What are systems of record, systems of authority, so that users know they're getting valid and accurate data? And what are the parameters and policies you have for data use in the district? Who should be able to access data in what ways and for what purposes? And this is a really critical first step, because the more integrated your systems become, the more freely that data flows, you really need to understand what data is flowing where and for what purpose. Or we start to have things happen like, hey, I'm trying to figure out which students are chronically absent. Well, it happens that 3 different departments have calculated chronic absenteeism in different ways, right? And all of a sudden, we're in a discussion trying to figure out how to do intervention, and we can't even agree on the list of kids that are eligible for intervention, right? Those are the kinds of problems that technology won't solve. Those are the kind of problems that humans have to sit down and agree on how to solve. And that really is the role of data governance. So I think before starting this journey, putting this in place is a really critical and important component. So the other piece is getting a good handle, like once you've got the data governance in place, and I should say this, data governance absolutely critical that it's cross-departmental, and it represents not just the people who have to care for the data, so to speak, not the ones that just have to make sure it's stored right, it moves right, but the people who actually have to use it, because that's the most critical stakeholder in terms of data governance. And so if you can establish a strong foundation of data governance, I think the second piece is understanding what your current state is, auditing the current state, right? And this can be a completely overwhelming activity if you think about trying to document every piece of data, every tool, every process that deals with data in your district. It could take you years to get started. And so one of the things that we often do when we go in and talk to an organization who's on this path of trying to build better and more interoperable data infrastructure is say, what are the strategic priorities of your district? Like, what are the things that are most important to you? What are the things your leadership team is prioritizing, right? And then the second question are like, which are the critical operational processes that have to happen with a high degree of reliability and accuracy for your district to function, right? And those are places where you start and you focus your audit. You say, okay, I know that these are things that are absolutely core and critical to the function of the district, to providing instruction to students, to making, like, keeping the lights on day to day. You can look at those processes, talk to stakeholders, understand where are the pain points, where can't you get access to information, where do you spend lots of time going between source systems, creating spreadsheets, right? And then really laying out where does all this data live? What are the critical metrics that you use to make decisions in these processes? What are the policies we have around privacy and security of this data today? And really getting a good picture of how does it all operate. And I think I've seen really fascinating things come out of these data audits. It's always interesting to say you see fascinating things in data audits, right? Do you imagine how exciting my personal life is? I've got little kids. It's quite exciting, actually. They keep me on my toes. But there are fascinating things that come out. Like, hey, we end up finding out that this department didn't really like the assessment system that everybody else was using, so they just decided to buy a new one. So we have this whole repository of information over here that lives in this silo that nobody else actually knew and we had access to, right? We also have seen instances where the teachers say, oh yeah, I didn't really think that process was super important to put data in. Attendance, for instance, right? And the attendance clerk is like, holy cow, I get hundreds of phone calls a day of angry parents who've called me because they've been auto-dialed that says their kid is absent and didn't show up at school today because the teacher was like, yeah, I had other things to do besides turn in section attendance today, right? So it's like, you will surface these pain points when you go out and talk to users, and that to me is how you build the roadmap for where do you start in the data interoperability journey. You start where the pain points are biggest, where the opportunity is the biggest, right? And then I think most critical, and one of the things that the foundation is investing around, is to try to educate people that there are a wide range of solutions to data interoperability problems, right? Like, we advocate for the adoption of open data standards. I think Maureen talked to you yesterday about EdFi. Open data standard. It does not solve every single problem under the sun. There are other data standards that solve other interoperability problems. And so I think one of the critical things that needs to be done on the journey to achieving data interoperability is really prioritizing your problem space. And so as I think about the idea of interoperability problems in K-12, there's a couple of fairly well-defined problem spaces that I know we as a sector struggle with. Right, one is the notion of basic identity management. I don't want to have teachers and students have to log in to 20 different applications with different username and password, because we spend loads of time trying to recover usernames and passwords that way. And so there's basic identity management, right? And I know that's a problem you all are tackling here at a statewide level with single sign-on. There is the idea that we want seamless application integration, meaning I may be assigning a set of work to a student, and that's going to include going to take some assessment in an assessment tool. It's going to include possibly going to watch videos in a learning application, right? A number of different things. You want them to have a central point where they go, and they launch off to all these other applications, and they end up at the right assessment. They end up at the right piece of content in this learning application. And so that's a problem of application interoperability, and that has a specific data standard that's relevant and useful to solve that problem. You may have problems around content interoperability. So you want to, you bought a new assessment item bank. You chose one for reading, one for math. You need to bring them together into the same place. You bought an online learning curriculum. You want to try to get all of that content into one learning management system, right? That's a data standard problem. But it's a very different interoperability problem than, say, trying to solve a student outcomes interoperability problem. So if you're trying to say, hey, we're moving to standards-based report cards, and that means we're going to need to get a bunch of outcomes data aligned to standards out of a bunch of different systems, right? That's a totally different interoperability problem. And so I raise this because as you think about trying to identify solutions, being really clear about your problem space is important, right? If you talk about these, I'm going to share just a couple of examples, most of which y'all may have heard, and they're fairly common, and they're standards or interoperability solutions available in the market, right? So the idea of provisioning basic user information, Clever provides an interoperability platform to do that. So your teachers don't have to type roster information everywhere, right? There are other solutions. IMS offers one roster. EdFi has an enrollment API. There's a variety of things in the market that could help you to address that problem. But you would not say, I have an interoperability problem, and mean you have an application interoperability problem and try to use Clever to solve that, because it's a different problem, right? IMS provides the learning tools integration data standard, which allows you to seamlessly connect applications. And that's I put an example up here of Canvas. If anyone uses that as their LMS, you know that they negotiate agreements. I call them the bilateral trade agreements with learning applications that create LTI connections to Canvas, so that can be the central launch point for students to go to and be able to access seamlessly other applications, right? But just like you wouldn't use Clever to solve the application integration problem, you don't use LTI to solve a student outcomes data problem, right? And so that's the domain where EdFi is focused, is saying, if I want to create an early warning system and I require attendance data from my SIS, discipline data from my behavior management system, assessment data from my assessment data warehouse, and grades from my SIS, you have to have a data standard that's able to move that data around, either across applications or to a centralized data store, to be able to create an early warning system, right? And so that's solving a completely different problem. And so that's the reason why I would say, as you go through that process of first identifying the low-hanging fruit, doing the audit and documenting what the current state looks like, and prioritizing, you can start to get really specific about what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and what are the market-based solutions available to solve that problem. Does that make sense? Okay. So the last thing I'll say on going down this journey is that as a district or a school, you have tremendous power to influence change. You have tremendous power to influence change individually, and certainly as you band together collectively, right? And one of the primary points of leverage comes from your ability to procure things, to buy things, right? Just like consumers. Like if we all stopped buying cell phones, they wouldn't have solved the contact card problem. We all kept buying them, we all kept complaining about it, and eventually the problem got solved. And so I would really encourage you to think about, as you narrow down your problem spaces and figure out where you really want to prioritize your focus, think about the ways you can use your procurement contracts to help to move the interoperability conversation forward in the market. Right, so if you're going to release an RFP for a new tool, including interoperability requirements, the use of open data standards where they're relevant in your procurement can certainly demonstrate to the market the importance of this and increase the odds you get a solution that actually utilizes those things. But the one thing I think that's important to think about here is everyone in your process has to be educated about the importance of this, right? So it is not uncommon that this happens. You put this in an RFP with the best of intentions. You may get responses. The most attractive response from maybe a functionality or cost standpoint says, I'm not super interested in that interoperability requirement in your RFP, so I'm just going to remain silent or tell you I'm not doing that, right? And then when push comes to shove, someone in the academic side or someone in the classroom that's on the procurement group says, we really need this tool now, and this is the best one. And the IT team is just going to figure out this interoperability thing on their own. Like, we're going to give on that requirement, right? And we need to start commit to not doing that, because it's really, like, it's just like when you have kids. When you tell them not to do something, but then you let them keep doing it anyhow, they don't change their behavior. I know this, because I was informing Maureen and Dean. I'm the soft one in the parenting discipline world. So my kids don't change, because I say no snacks, no treats after dinner, and then they get in the pantry and take one, and I don't do anything about it. Right? Don't do this. And I'd say related to this is the notion of like following through the interoperability requirement into your contract language. And so this doesn't have to be just for new procurement. This can be when you're renewing contracts within your organization, really specifying if you want an interoperable solution from a vendor, telling them that, requiring it, specifying which data standards or which solutions you want, putting timelines around it so that you can hold vendors accountable so that they can appropriately prioritize this work into their backlog to make sure these things get executed. And also being real specific in telling them if you want them to stay current in terms of the use of open standards as versions evolve, et cetera. Like, the more specific that you can get here, the easier it is for you as an organization, be it a vendor or a school district, to honestly have an informed conversation of what everyone's expectations are and what the cost and the timeline of meeting those expectations is going to be. And so I put Project Unicorn up here. This is an effort that the foundation is participating in, and it is really aimed at trying to create more awareness around data interoperability problems and the challenges that they really pose for teachers and students in the classroom. It's about bringing together districts across the country to sign a pledge and kind of exert their collective power and raise the importance of data interoperability. So sign a pledge that said, look, we're committed to having interoperable solutions in the classroom so that we can have high quality data that teachers can use and we can protect student privacy. And signing a pledge that you're only going to procure solutions that that are interoperable, that use open standards where they're available and have clear interoperability solutions. And it's also for vendors to come together who want to lead the market and commit to creating these solutions and being good players in the marketplace. And so if that sounds interesting to you, you can go to the Project Unicorn website and check that out. Yeah, and with that, I would say, are there any questions? I have a few resources to offer, but in terms of my ability to not fall off the stage and deal with slides that don't really look like what they do on the screen, that's all I got to say. Okay. I won't take it personally. I know post-lunch is hard. Should have fueled y'all up with coffee. I will just leave a couple of resources. If you're interested in this topic, you say, hey, this is a problem that my organization wants to try to solve. I want to start building capacity. They're going to get some microphones just in case y'all think of questions. The foundation has a blog series that kind of goes through the basics of interoperability from the perspective of what the foundation's learned, the vendor community, districts, and teachers. Project Unicorn's got some good resources. These are interesting case studies because they provide a picture of the reality of what the market looks like today, right? And what some of the struggles schools are facing, what some struggles vendors face as they think about trying to build interoperable solutions. And then Getting Smart has a series of school profiles of schools that are trying to move down this path of data interoperability. And so these might be just good resources to provide some thought starters for conversation within your organization.
So Jamie, from Nebraska's perspective, and I think I shared this morning kind of with this group that, we talk about a local control state, and my definition now of that is the state doesn't have the money to do it, so that means we're a local control state, right? So, but that's not unusual across the country when we think about these things. And we're trying to find, and certainly what we've done in working with EdFi, what we've done on building a perspective on how we're going to actually improve the use of data, but also thinking a little more deeply about how other educational tools will be developed and move forward. We're really trying to imagine what that future needs to look like. But it is an interesting space because the state doesn't necessarily go out and buy these various tools. But what have you seen in other states that we could benefit from for setting standards? Us kind of from a state perspective really trying to drive that conversation because we have schools of very small schools in the room to very large schools in the room to folks that are just trying to struggle to keep up with the crazy ideas that we might have from the Department of Education, but realistically really trying to find ways to do it well and set a model that's going to be long lasting for Nebraska. Are you seeing that in other states?
Yeah, I think that's definitely we have. So I would say y'all have taken one step towards enabling interoperability at the district level, which is you've aligned your state data collection to a data standard, right, to EdFi. And so whether y'all think about this at the local level or not, that has power outside of just use at the state for sending data up to the state. You now have vendors within your district ecosystem who are aligned to a standard, and if you wanted to leverage that locally for moving data across your source systems, creating your own local repository of data for reporting, it's much easier for you to take that step because the vendors within the state of Nebraska align to that standard, right? I'd say the other piece that I've seen is particularly when you're rolling out new initiatives, like potentially related to the Future Ready, where there's thematic relationship, where there's going to be significant data interoperability challenges that I've seen states issue kind of, they're not requirements per se because you're not procuring the tools, but issuing strong preference. If you're going to participate in this initiative within the state, then we would strongly preference vendors who are going to, and districts would strongly preference vendors who are going to adopt whatever the relevant open standards are. And so just making more of a push and I think a public push around that at the state level, even if you're not procuring the tools, but expressing that the districts have a preference for that is definitely another strong step. One of the things that we've seen, and I had the example of the Florida Code Collaborative up there, this idea of creating interoperable solutions, it can be a daunting journey, and doing it together is oftentimes better than doing it on your own. One of the things we've seen across states like Florida and Michigan, particularly with some of the districts that are smaller and maybe don't have a big technology team, is they've band together in collaboratives to go down this process, right? So they've come together and said, look, we have a shared vision to have interoperability, and we may share a common reason for that. It may be because we want to all improve our literacy rates and we need better literacy reporting or we need early warning reporting. But at the end of the day, you all support the idea of adoption of the standard and adoption of a common data infrastructure. And so working together both gives you greater power in external conversations with vendors, but also allows those districts to share the cost of doing this kind of implementation as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Hi. So I have the liberty of working with more than one state when we come to compliance, and so I want to know, is any focus on actually, because mobility is always a problem that we are trying to address at students level. What are we doing across state? Is there any initiatives that are going on so that this data can not just right now we're trying to achieve the first level where moving from districts to state. What about, is there anything going on in that space across state?
Yeah. So at a macro level, federally, no, outside of the notion of like the common education data standards and trying to get states, districts, solutions to align around CEDS. No, at like a regional level, particularly in areas within a region where there's high levels of mobility. I've seen some regional examples where they're creating collaborations to share student like transcript information across states, but those are really regionally based. And some of what I would say is like my hypothesis of that is that there's a lot of sensitivity around moving student records, right? Moving student data around. And when we start to cross state boundaries where laws may differ, policies may differ, I think there's policy barriers that have to be addressed to really enable that kind of cross-state sharing of information. But you work with Power School, I'm gathering from your shirt. Either that or you're just a huge power user of Power School. Either way, it's awesome. But I think you all maybe have seen that the more common standards get adopted, there is a value on the vendor end, right, of like you're no longer having to deal with a common set of, or a disconnected set of requirements against states. So I think it certainly could lay the groundwork for more conversation about how data could be shared as students move from place to place. But to me, that's largely, we have to tackle the policy and the privacy and the security concerns before we could really tackle the technical concerns of that.